Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ellie Ekman. I am a senior fellow at the American Economic Liberties Project, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. Very excited to talk about concentrated economic power as part of the American Economic Liberties Project. And today we're going to be talking specifically from a national securities lean, talking about the nuclear triad. So a couple notes. I'm in DoD, so all opinions are my own. Have to say that. And then if you have any questions throughout the panel, please just chat me or chat everyone, and we'll get your questions in. So we have a great panel today, and I'd like to make some introductions. So we have Mr. Mark Thompson. He has been writing in the national security space for over 40 years. He currently writes for the Project on Government Oversight, and he has a weekly newsletter called The Bunker, and is the author of The Broken Leg of America's Nuclear Triad. So Mark, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Al.
Next, we have Sarah Sirota. She's an associate editor at Inside Defense and the author of Boeing Confirms It Won't Bid for GBSD, Program is Structured, and writes extensively on the Pentagon and within particularly the Air Force. So Sarah, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
And Lucas, last but not least, Lucas Kuntz. He's the director of National Security Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project and the author of America's Monopoly Crisis Hits the Military. He's also written on supply chains, tech, how it relates to national defense. So he's also a Marine Corps veteran. So Lucas, great to have you with us. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Ellie.
So let's get started. After the United States developed nuclear capabilities in World War II, we kind of pivoted in strategy to the Cold War and fighting the USSR, and so the nuclear triad, the submarines, the strategic bombers, and the intercontinental ballistic missiles were developed as part of a redundant capability strategy. So that if one leg was knocked out, the United States could still respond in the case of a nuclear attack. And so it's been a while since the end of the Cold War. It's been quite a few years. And so now we're facing a need to modernize. So the United States needs to modernize not only the weapon systems, but also the infrastructure surrounding all of these nuclear capabilities. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves and why we really wanted to do this panel and look at where we are now. So Mark, let's start with you and your article. You wrote it in September 2019. Can you give us a quick overview? We'll kind of talk about policy later, but walk us through why you wrote this, what's going on with the program, how did we get to where we are right now?
Thanks, and thanks for you folks for inviting me to participate today. I mean, come on, it's the nuclear triad, right? 2 legs have been good enough for humans for at least 20 or 30 years, but we need 3. Okay, let's understand, as you say, El, the redundancy element. Ergo, well, if they can take out our bombers, we need the ICBMs, or if they can do this, we have our subs to rely on. Well, the fact of the matter is, in the ICBM space, we are now thwarting the wisdom of a triad by putting all of our nuclear eggs in the Northrop basket. I mean, Northrop is building the B-22, B-21 bomber. It builds the solid rocket motor engines for the D-5 missiles used on the Navy submarines. And now it's going to be the prime on the ICBM. So if I don't quite get the logic of we need the redundancy over here, but on the corporate side, we don't need any redundancy. That's the first problem I have here. I mean, in the last 25 years, the number of companies building solid rocket motors has dropped from 6 to 2. And DoD warned in 2017 that we could soon end up with 1. And if that were to happen, they said it would lead to cost increases because of a lack of competition, a dearth of internal research and development efforts, and a risk to the supply chain if anything really bad happened. I mean, this is part of an overall thing. We're talking monopoly here. We're talking mergers. Since the Cold War, we've gone from 51 aerospace and defense companies down to 5 big ones. As UC Santa Cruz professor Dan Rules calls them, they are now Walmarts of war. And it is it's a very narrow precipice on which to base national security. I think in terms of the single ICBM leg with one contractor, yeah, that's moving ahead. The Pentagon has given Northrop a $13 billion development contract to get this thing up and going. And it looks right now like we're on atomic autopilot.
Lot to digest. That's wow. Thanks, Mark. Sarah, can you talk a little bit more about, so good overview about Boeing and how Boeing plays into this picture, how now we've gone from 51 to very few. Let's hear about more about Boeing and Northrop in this particular area.
Yeah, so Boeing and Northrop both had contracts to do early design work on GBSD, the next ICBM system. But basically, in July 2019, as the Air Force was preparing to release its solicitation for the big development contract that Mark just mentioned, Boeing issued a number of complaints to the Air Force about the way it was handling the acquisition, namely that there was unfairness in the acquisition because Northrop Grumman owned one of the 2 large solid rocket motor companies, Orbital ATK, and Boeing claimed that that gave them an unfair advantage when it came to cost, and that the Air Force would have to fix this situation in order to create fairness, and if not, then Boeing was going to withdraw. The Air Force then ultimately released its request for proposals that did not address Boeing's concerns. So Boeing reiterated that they're not going to bid on the big development contract. Therefore, they decided to pursue some sort of teaming arrangement with Northrop Grumman, where they could essentially work as either a co-contractor or a subcontractor on their proposal for GBSD. But Northrop Grumman rejected that offer, created its own nationwide team with a lot of different contractors, but not Boeing. The Boeing then, asked the Air Force to intervene and essentially force some sort of teaming arrangement. The Air Force, said it was open to that, but rejected it. Ultimately, Northrop submitted its proposal. Boeing was no longer involved. The Air Force cut off Boeing's funding under the previous contract since it wasn't going to be continuing with the program anymore. And then the Air Force last year ultimately awarded Northrop Grumman that $13 billion contract to develop it. And also a lot more money is going to be coming on down the road as we move forward. I mean, this is supposed to be a contract, a program that's worth hundreds of billions of dollars over its life cycle. And Northrop Grumman, I mean, without competition, essentially just is going to get a huge chunk of that. So that's where we're at with that program.
Okay. You brought up something, I kind of want to skip around a little bit. You brought up solid rocket motors, and you talked a little bit about orbital ATK and about Northrop buying orbital ATK. So I think this is vertical integration. A company trying to buy up their suppliers, and so now Boeing can't compete. Does Boeing do this too? So it seems like Boeing is complaining that this is an unfair practice. Does Boeing do this too? Mark, you can jump in. Is this a normal thing, in defense, or is this kind of a one-time thing that's, that just so happens to be a problem with this space?
I think this is a really common occurrence. I mean, a great example is that after Northrop bought Orbital ATK, the only other large solid rocket motor producer was Aerojet Rocketdyne, which was independent. And Lockheed Martin just announced that it's going to be purchasing Aerojet Rocketdyne. So, I mean, now there will essentially be no domestic large solid rocket motor suppliers in the United States. So I think that's, I mean, Boeing, all the defense companies do this.
And it's worth pointing out, of course, that now that Lockheed and Northrop have locked up these SRM makers, Raytheon is complaining about Lockheed's purchase. So you've got Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon all at each other's throats for fear of stealing business for one another. It's almost as bad as the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy.
I don't think they're that bad. Mark.
So, at least not the Marines, right, Ellie?
Yeah, not the Marines.
You're part of the Navy, okay? You're part of the Navy.
Okay, great. Moving on. Lucas, I want to bounce over to you real quick. So, we've talked a little bit about cost. We've talked about, competition. Why does this matter? Like, so, as a veteran, as a taxpayer, I just right off the bat, like, why should we care?
Yeah, so Mark mentioned earlier, he didn't reference it by name, but the 2017 Industrial Capabilities Report from the Pentagon, which looks at this exact problem and does talk about how it increases cost, decreases research, and increases supply chain risk. And so what we have, and that's because there's no competition. And what we've seen, I take, Sarah was talking about Boeing. We've been talking about Boeing. I'll give a couple examples where we have no competition and what that has meant. And so the first one is, with Boeing, right? So Boeing is the only the only real American aircraft manufacturer for certain types of aircraft. And we all saw a couple of years ago, they launched the 737 MAX completely unsafely. And instead of a competitor being able to step into that field and sort of take their business, instead what we had was them coming to the federal government and asking for a $60 billion bailout last year during COVID, and the government agreeing to do it. And then even worse, we started to give money through the Fed Reserve into the bond market, and they actually, that bailout was going to have strings attached, but since we dumped a bunch of money into the Fed Reserve, then Boeing was able to just float a bunch of corporate bonds in the equities market and got a bailout, kind of an indirect bailout from the Fed Reserve, and now we don't even have any control over the company and its decision-making, its monopoly power. So it's an example of how when you have a monopoly, there are no more consequences in the market. Like, the United States, our capitalist system depends on competition in the market in order to get the best products, and we don't have that right now. The other thing I would say is another good example is Qualcomm. So Qualcomm is a monopoly chip maker. They don't actually make chips, they design them, and then they ship them over like TSMC in Taiwan to actually do the fabrication. But Qualcomm was sued by the FTC for having a monopoly and having monopoly business practices. But the Department of Defense looked at that and said, oh, wait a second, we need them because they're a monopoly and they're the only people that make what we're doing. So we're going to actually protect this company that is in front of the FTC. So the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment sends a letter to the FTC and says, please don't hold Qualcomm accountable for their predatory practices because we need them to compete with China in our competition with China. What they're leaving out of that, though, is the fact that Qualcomm had given $150 million to a Chinese R&D fund for semiconductors and is participating and was working with the Chinese government. And so, like, when you get to a point where you're more reliant on a single company than the company is reliant on you, risk comes into play and they can do whatever they want without consequences. We are now moving toward that position with the Nuclear Triad. Like, what could go wrong, right? That's why we named it this event that. We've done the exact same thing in the Nuclear Triad space. And it's bad for cost, bad for national security, increases risk, and just leaves us in a place where we have no more control over this, very expensive program that is a cornerstone of the national defense architecture.
Thanks, Lucas. Yeah, what Mark said, the Walmarts of war, they don't actually have to sell to just the United States. They can sell to other countries as well. It's a free market. So going back, Lucas, you mentioned risk, and I kind of want to go back to something that Mark said in his article talking about risk. So cost and risk. Mark, you talked about how the Air Force used older data to do their cost estimates of the entire program. So we're talking, billions of dollars doing these cost estimates. But some of the modeling and some of those assumptions were a little bit older. Do you think that that will increase the long-term sustainment risk of the program, or just, in a couple of years, are we going to be over budget? Are we going to be, not maintaining timelines because of the original assumptions? I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Is that a serious question?
All of my questions are serious questions.
Okay, then I'll answer it in that way. I've been doing this for more than 40 years. I can count on one hand the number of original assumptions that were borne out in the final analysis. You look at the F-16 perhaps, some of the missile programs, but here's some audio-visual aids just to give us a sense of what's happening. And I'm not a 21st century guy, so I don't know how this is going to come out, but this is from the Bureau of Economic Research showing, measuring the difference between the number of contracts and how much the big contractors got. The red shows the concentration, the increasing concentration in our defense space from roughly 1985 to 2005. The good folks at GAO, excuse my AV device, looked at who was getting what. And basically, I can send you these things as PDFs, but I didn't know how to display them on the screen. But they show that, less than half, only about a third of major defense contracts are competed. And among those that are competed, half of those that are competed go to the big five. So you see this monopoly sort of growing. In terms of the numbers used at the front end, the old saying, too early to tell, too late to kill. That is a cliche or a stereotype, but there's always some truth to cliches and stereotypes, which is why they are cliches and stereotypes. We've just bought 3 destroyers for $24 billion, $8 billion a copy. They are still not combat ready. I can remember when the B-2, you talk about numbers. Back in the 80s when, the debate was on and B-1, B-2, and President Reagan came ahead with the B-2 after Jimmy Carter started it. And George Wilson, the late, great Pentagon reporter of the Washington Post, had a story on the front page, 86, 87, 89. And the headline had the number $500 million in it per plane. Nobody could believe it. They were flabbergasted. Well, the plane ended up costing $2.4 billion a copy, 5 times as much. Now, a big part of that was because they wanted 132. They only got 21, but that happens all the time because they say they live in this self-licking ice cream cone that says, well, we're going to need this many ships or this many airplanes, and everyone signs up to it. But by the time the rubber meets the road, they can never buy that many and have to amortize the cost over a far few number of widgets, and the price just goes through the roof. I just think that it's so interesting. When I first agreed to do this, one of the first stories I read was Kathleen Hicks, the new DepSecDef, talking at a confirmation hearing about they might have to put a brake on future mergers and acquisitions because things were getting so compressed. Yet the same day in National Defense Magazine, they were quoting analysts who were saying it's inevitable. I mean, if we are an economic system, this pressure, it's like physics, it's just going to drive these people together. And unless we take legal actions to thwart them, that's where it's going to be. And I think that you guys are doing a great thing and sort of trying to raise the red flag in advance of this occurring. But, it's like gravity, it's there. And I don't know how or to what degree it's going to be changed by good folks talking about it.
Yeah, so a lot of risk in this program and in other programs within the DoD. Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add with that? Anything you've seen in terms of cost overrun or?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark really gave a good summary there. I will just say that in my observations and reporting on the Air Force for a few years now, I will say there are some voices inside the Pentagon that are increasingly aware of this problem and want to try and get around it. The Air Force's former acquisition executive, Will Roper, was very active in trying to bring in some smaller companies and not only rely on the big prime defense contractors, particularly as they try to move towards this digital modernization and, you know, increasing use of automation and artificial intelligence, getting some of these more like Silicon Valley kind of companies, which, you know, might have its own implications, but conversation for another day. And and so I think there is some awareness. You know, you did have Ellen Lord, who came from industry, who, you know, wrote that letter to the FTC that Lucas had mentioned, but you also do have alternative voices that are increasingly aware.
Great, thanks. Yeah, before we dive into policy, one last question in terms of landscape with, you know, like I said before, landscape has shifted from the Cold War. We're dealing with a lot of new types of requirements in order to ensure that, you know, systems are ready to go when they need to be. I'm talking particularly about cyber. And frankly, like the nuclear triad is going to be a big target when it comes to hacking or any type of offensive cyber from other countries or from lone actors. So, you know, I'd like to hear thoughts on how, you know, how we can maybe get better with cyber. Have you seen consolidation in this particular space, just because it relates to the triad? Lucas, I know you've written on a little bit on tech.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, and I think I'll just talk about what my biggest worry is on this, and that's that what we're talking about today, you know, we're talking a lot of aircraft, nuclear triad, we've talked about ships and things like that. These are all of our legacy systems, and our legacy systems, trucks, everything else, have been captured by the big five, and they have been consolidated, and we are in this space right now where costs are higher, innovation is lower, and there's more risk in the legacy systems. And the future of warfare and the future of conflict is probably going to be moving away from those types of systems and toward things like cyber. It might be moving just towards, you know, it might not even be military at all. It might be production of semiconductors. It might be the ability to, I guess, play with somebody's supply chains and things like that. And so my biggest worry, especially on the supply chain side, is that our future systems are going to be consolidated and captured the exact same way as the past ones have been. And so I would just say that what we really need to do is we need to learn from our mistakes on the past ones, and going forward, we need to make sure that we use every tool in the toolkit to keep consolidation from happening in the future systems. And when big players like the Googles or the Microsofts or the Amazons come in and say, we can just handle this entire thing for you, we need to be very cautious of that and make sure that it doesn't happen, so we don't have the same sort of capture.
I'll also jump in. You know, the big SolarWinds breach that really hit all corners of the country was definitely a wake-up call for some in the military about wanting to make their systems more resilient and cyber secure. I spoke with the Air Force's Chief Software Officer, Nicholas Shailan, who was describing all the different methods that they're taking. And an interesting point that he brought up to me was that this scare about SolarWinds and increasing attacks on digital infrastructure is creating some nervousness inside the Pentagon about working with commercial industry, that thinking that they're more vulnerable. However, he brought up that, you know, if the Pentagon cuts off ties to industry, to contractors and companies, I mean, then they're just going to be so far behind that it won't even be possible to compete, because all the innovation is happening in the private sector. You know, there's some people who will debate the extent that, you know, there should be reliance on commercial industry, but it was an interesting point, I thought, about the way conversations are changing about Pentagon and industry relations in the wake of the SolarWinds attack, and increasingly more that's going to come.
Sarah, we have a question, you know, from the audience. You know, what about the confidence? in our ability, or the United States ability, DoD's ability to protect the triad? Do you think there is confidence in the building? Mark, you can jump in as well. Is that something that you've kind of been hearing about?
Yeah, I know that the Air Force has been prioritizing the ground-based strategic deterrent, the ICBM system, when it comes to all the new and innovative ways of doing cybersecurity. The Air Force is increasingly relying on this DevSecOps strategy for cybersecurity and digital development, and they are making GBSD like the #1 program that they are focusing that on. So I do think there's definitely a big awareness about the vulnerabilities of the nuclear triad to cyber attacks, and they are, at least that they tell reporters, are working on it.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that I've been hearing about a cyber Pearl Harbor since shortly after Pearl Harbor. It's interesting if you follow what industry does. They've been extraordinarily reluctant to beef up their defenses. They're doing so in a all deliberate speed kind of way, but they're not petrified. And I think this is reflected also in the US military. There is at the front end, there's all these voices of concern, but when it really comes down to where the money meets the road, they'd much rather buy a new weapon system than protect their internet infrastructure. I think we need to be careful here when we're talking about vulnerability. I'll tell you this, it's far more likely that nuclear triad will be used by accident than will be used because of hackers. And I think it's something we need to keep in mind, that the reality is that the hair trigger notion and the prospect of false alerts, I think, are a bigger problem than the notion of hackers getting involved. If you just look at recent things that have happened to our country, bad guys took down 2 of the biggest buildings in our nation 20 years ago. We have one of the world's worst records when it comes to dealing with this global pandemic. And can you imagine Americans storming the Capitol, trying to overturn a duly elected president? I mean, if you just look at those 3 things, and then you look at our nuclear arsenal, I wouldn't be too secure about our ability to deal with all the dangers that it poses.
No, those are great points. Thanks, Mark and Sarah. So this is, I think, kind of a good segue to the policy piece, because I think we've all been hitting on the policy piece of this. There's a lot of players in this ecosystem. You have Congress with competing interests. You have business, and they have to report to shareholders. At the end of the day, even if they are, they do care about national security. You have individuals, you have the Department of Defense, so a lot of competing interests, and I think it you end up having to kind of balance it. So I look forward to hearing how you think best to do that. But I want to talk about something in particular. First of all, with Congress, on the 25th of the last month, Senator Inhofe, the top Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and his counterpart, Congressman Rogers on the HASC, published an article where they talk about the importance of the triad as a strategic deterrent. And they also kind of go into their worry that, we're going to do away with the triad. I think because of, I think there's some parts of the Democratic Party who have been more keen on getting rid of the triad altogether than I would say the Republican side. And so I think it's been a recent point, and it really brings up 2 questions in my mind. Do you think there is going to be a food fight with the policy of whether or not we need a triad? Do you think there's going to be a lot of argument for that? And then I think more importantly, what's the best way to go about modernizing the triad? So Mark, I know you specifically talked to former SecDef William Perry, in your article about the deterrence piece. So before I kick it over to Lucas, do you have any thoughts?
Well, just that, over many decades, if you get Air Force people tired or drunk enough, they will concede that pretty much the subfleet is all we need. Now you can throw the bombers in there simply because of the flexibility they bring. But Bill Perry will say, very straightforward, that we don't need this asymmetry of the triad compared to the Russians or the Chinese when they get there. The subs are sufficient. That is a blasphemy to the nuclear theocracy, but I'm sorry, it's true. The Pentagon has been saying for decades that, well, there could be a, the Soviets at the time had lasers that could see through the ocean and see where all of our boomers were. And the GAO knocked that down repeatedly over, 1983 was the time I remember they really wowed it upside the head. The triad is a relic. Now, triad boosters hate to hear that word, so let's just call it an artifact or a fossil. It has been retroactively justified. We didn't decide one day, let's have a triad. We had bombers, and then we had ICBMs, and then we had nuclear missile firing submarines. And all of a sudden we had these things, and we said, well, how do we justify them? Ta-da! Let's have a triad. And they had a triad. And now that we've got it, we can't get rid of it. The Cold War has been over for 30 years. When you have guys like Bill Perry and Hosh Cartwright saying that subs are sufficient, I just don't see the logic of it. The logic, of course, is like it is everything else in defense. It's jobs and it's lawmakers. You have the ICBM caucus. Well, guess where they're from? The High Plains of America, where all of those bases are located. I'm from Rhode Island. Believe me, I know about electric boat and nuclear submarines. And the bomber crews out in Florida are the same way. It's basically, hey, lawmaker, you don't come after my leg of the triad, and I won't come after yours. And they've sort of struck this deal that we've now been living with for decades, to the detriment of national security, to the detriment of where we could spend our money more smartly. And you Marines should know about that, seeing as you're the only service that really never played in the nuclear space. And we could use it for other stuff as well. But that's basically where I come down on the triad in terms of why and how you modernize it. The nuclear infrastructure in this country is just like our national infrastructure. We've denied it for 30 years. It's falling apart. And now everything needs to be done at once. Well, that's pretty stupid, but that's the pickle we now find ourselves in. And the Pentagon is saying, hey, $1.7 trillion, through 2046 to buy and sustain this teeny tiny portion of our national defense. I don't think it flies.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I've heard, in the past that all policy, you should do it sober. You should talk about it sober, and you should talk about it drunk. And if it works both ways, then it's probably good policy. So I don't know if you've heard of that in your 40 years of in this space, but I just I want to throw that out. It is also something you said brought up something I read with Honorable Kathleen Hicks, the new Deputy Secretary of Defense. And she was talking about this in her hearing, her confirmation hearing. And she said, I think our decisions on nuclear weapons should be driven foremost by strategy. And, I for one, thought that was a good way to put it. It's about strategy. What's the requirement? And then we can go from there. But Lucas, I want to turn it over to you with, how do we encourage competition in this space? It's arguably very important. So like to hear your thoughts. Oh, you're on mute.
I think we can learn from our mistakes, and one of those is what we saw with the Northrop Orbital ATK merger, and we need to, now what we have is we have Lockheed saying they need to buy Aerojet Rocketdyne in order to compete with Northrop Grumman, and so the answer is not actually more consolidation. And in Lockheed's last, I'll read the quote. In Lockheed's last 2024 quarter earnings call, when they were discussing the consolidation of the defense industrial base, their CEO and president said that we need to roll up industry even more. And he said that vertical integration concerns from a classic antitrust perspective are dwarfed by the benefits that come from monopolization. And so he actually suggested that we mimic the authoritarian defense base of North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia. And so what you see is industries pushing very hard for more consolidation. Boston Consulting, KPMG, Deloitte are all encouraging the Biden Pentagon to embrace more defense mergers. So we really this is the front lines of where we lose our competitive atmosphere. Like, we are not going to beat China in a sheer numbers game, right? We have to have the competitive atmosphere and the innovation that comes from that. And so what we have the tools to create that. I mean, so instead of approving Lockheed Aerojet Rocketdyne merger, what we need to do is unwind the Northrop Orbital ATK one, and then Lockheed doesn't have the same excuse. There are a whole litany of defense mergers and acquisitions that we can just unwind. And people say, oh, that's going to be a big problem. Like, you can't break up companies. I'm sorry, Wall Street spins off companies all the time and everybody's happy about it. These are just spin-offs. The companies aren't going to disappear. We're just going to create a more competitive atmosphere so that we can get essentially the fruits of the capitalism that we have here and that is going to help us compete with these authoritarian states. So I would say that that's the first step is to do unwinding, and the second is to stop the mergers and acquisitions. And someone named anonymous attendee asked a question in the Q&A: what role does DoD play in knocking back FTC antitrust concerns? So when we got the Orbital ATK and Northrop merger, the Pentagon reviewed that, and Ellen Lord went to the FTC and said, this is going to be great. We need this. Competition's still going to be there. And then, just like Sarah said earlier, sure enough, as everyone at the FTC, or as people at the FTC were concerned about, and in think tank world were concerned about, this is going to eliminate competition. We're not going to have a competition for the ground-based deterrent system. And sure enough, we didn't have it. So what we need is people at the Pentagon who are actually willing to look at this. In the same Hicks hearing, Senator Blumenthal got up and talked about submarine consolidation, right? And Kathleen Hicks, in addition to saying that nuclear weapons should be driven by strategy, said that that consolidation reduces innovation. So she sees that. She actually needs to act on it. The Congressional Budget Act or the Budget Control Act, I don't remember which it was, of 2011, gave DoD the ability to review mergers and acquisitions in this field. And so we can do it. Like, we review everything. There's an Office of Industrial Policy that reviews every single merger and acquisition in the defense sphere. It's just that they've been silent for so long, and they haven't proactively fought it, and they've actually coordinated with companies to try to support mergers and acquisitions instead of pushing back. We need that sort of new mindset and mentality if we're going to ever change.
Sarah, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just add that, the Federal Trade Commission's role is to look over mergers and acquisitions and investigate anti-competitive behavior. And yet, they investigated the Northrop Orbital ATK merger, but allowed it to go through. And they issued a civil investigative demand to follow up and do another inquiry into the merger after Boeing complained about unfairness in the GBSD contract. We haven't heard any updates on any measures that they may have taken. And now the FTC supposedly is also investigating the Lockheed Martin Aerojet Rocketdyne merger. But in theory, you could say they shouldn't allow it. But if they've already allowed the Orbital ATK one, to what extent is that biased and unfair in that scenario? So I think that it also just comes down to the Federal Trade Commission potentially asserting itself more when it comes to these investigations and the power that it yields.
So potentially winding back some of these mergers, enforcing competitive practices in the market. What about, Lucas? I know you've written a little bit on R&D funding. Sarah, you mentioned small businesses. Are there ways to help small businesses get into this space, or ensure that we're funding R&D so that way businesses across the board can use. And when I say we, I mean, the federal government continuing to fund R&D. So that way, small businesses not just the, the big five, can take advantage of this basic science and use it to, become companies that can work with DoD. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Defense Innovation Unit is doing a good job of creating a pathway for companies into the defense sphere. And I think what we see is, we have a monopoly problem with just approaching the Pentagon, because one of the things that you have to be able to do and to understand is to operate on the congressional budget cycle, right? So it's like a 2-year cycle. And so these small companies aren't able, so in the Defense Innovation Unit, they'll get a company, they'll have them do a prototype project, but then if it takes 2 years to do a follow-on, procurement contract, we're in a position where they don't have the ability to sit for 2 years. So their option is either to sell to a prime, or lose. And so, whereas primes, they're financially structured because they've been doing this forever. Their innovation is based around understanding and working with the current budget cycle, right? Like that's where they're innovators, and they are innovators there, and they're very successful there. Whereas other companies aren't able to do that because it's not their primary focus. And so I think we do need to make it easier to have pathways into the government. I think scaling DIU at a higher level would be one of the ways that we can do that.
I'll also jump in and say the Air Force has an organization called AFWorks that's doing outreach to some of these smaller innovative companies. A good example of a program that they're doing is called Agility Prime, where they're trying to work with some of the smaller startups that are working on electric flying vehicles. Dr. Roper, their former Air Force acquisition executive who I mentioned before, has said that he views this program as a way of preventing the offshoring of the electric vertical takeoff and landing industry in the same way, to prevent what happened essentially with the small drone industry with the offshoring. And now we're dependent primarily on Chinese companies. So, I think, like Lucas was saying, ways to, further strengthen programs like this would be a good way of reaching out to those smaller companies.
Thank you. I'm going to look at some of the questions that we have coming in. My last question, though, you get what you measure, sort of thing. Shareholders are kind of the stock price, shareholder price. That's what businesses are measuring. You have DoD with lethality, readiness, just sometimes hard to equate with dollars. Any thoughts on any other metrics or a way that we could measure the success of the industrial base, of competition, of how should we be able to say yes, this is right, this is wrong, this is a healthy competitive sphere, and this is not. Any thoughts?
How many wars have we won since World War II?
You want to talk a little bit more about that, Mark?
No, I think that's it. We exist on this plane. Come on. We've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. I remember when it began, I was at the Pentagon that day. And all the folks I talked to said, excuse the phone, all the folks I talked to that day said, hey, we'll be out in 6 months. And then something happened. And 19 and a half years later, we're still there. Now, obviously, the forces are greatly reduced, but it's in this realm, and this gets away from economics, but when you're in a rinky-dink country for 20 years and you don't prevail, you're not a superpower. You're certainly not a military superpower. Maybe the phrase military superpower is antiquated and isn't the right yardstick to use today. But the fact of the matter is, since I've been in this business, we won in Panama, we won in Grenada, and we won in Iraq 1.0. But that's it. And that's the yardstick we should be using. Everything else should flow from the yardstick. And if we're not winning, maybe we shouldn't be playing.
I think for me, it's just what is the what does competition look like, and how does that affect our supply chains and our national security? And when I say national security, I mean it very broadly. Like, you know, China right now is talking about taking away, or they've been discussing restricting their exports of rare earth minerals, which go into not just every complicated military end item, but also most of our consumer gadgets and electronics. And you know, semiconductor industry is another one where most of our semiconductors are fabricated in Taiwan, which is 80 miles off the coast of China, and in a place that now we're probably going to have to, now that we've seen what having no semiconductors here means, with vehicles not being able to be made, medical equipment not being able to be made, we're probably going to end up looking at defending Taiwan even more stringently or more aggressively. And so there are, and the reason for that is monopoly, right? Like TSMC has a monopoly on the production of semiconductors, and you know, maybe Samsung a little bit, which is on the Korean Peninsula, not exactly a lot better. And so what I think that we should look at is just our ability to innovate, but also our ability to not have these reliances that end up making us pay more and more money to defend them. And so you see that, I mean, you see that with oil over the years. When you talk about Iraq, like everybody said, the reason we're Iraq is for oil, right? Well, if we had all renewables, we wouldn't be screwing around over there anymore, and we could have saved the $14 trillion, whatever it is, that we spent there. And so I think it's, you know, return on investment. I think we need to take a broader look at what national security is. If a semiconductor fabrication plant costs $12 billion and an aircraft carrier costs $12 billion, and we need 3 more aircraft carriers to protect Taiwan, then maybe it's better to just build 3 fabrication plants here and get more jobs. But the reason we're in that situation is because we've let our industry consolidate. And so just, we need to stop the consolidation.
Yeah, point of order though, of course, those $12 billion aircraft carriers do not come with aircraft. So you're not going to defend Taiwan with 3 $12 billion aircraft. You're going to need 3 $20 billion aircraft. And that just, you know, went up by $24 billion. It's pretty amazing how these numbers get tossed around.
So I'm going to ask another question from the group, you know, talking about Northrop's resources and workforce. You know, Mark and Sarah, do you think they're going to be stretched thin by holding both the B-21 and GBSD contracts at the same time? We talked a little bit about, you know, cost overruns and delays. Do you think that's going to, you know, exacerbate that?
I'll let Mark take that one. I think he'd be better. I don't cover the B-21 as close.
No, but the notion is this, and this is what we see in our defense industrial base today. Through acquisitions or new programs or mergers, they simply grow, you know, like a blob or Jabba the Hutt, you know, to do this program, to do that program. Plainly, you can have good bookkeeping at a small firm or at a big firm. It's tougher at a big firm. So yes, to the questioner, it will be more difficult. I mean, you know, we still can't get an audit of the Pentagon, never mind its big contractors. I think that that is another downside of this consolidation we're seeing. You know, we've traded sniper rifles for shotguns, and when you shoot with a shotgun, you tend not to be as accurate as you are when you have a sniper rifle.
Another question. So Mark and Sarah, you're very, very involved with the goings-ons of the Pentagon. Where do you get all your information? How do you stay up to date with so many different topics? I'm just a little curious.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, one key thing that we do is something that's going to be happening in the next month or so, which is when the Pentagon rolls out its annual budget request. The National Defense Authorization Act every year is worked on by Congress and the Pentagon. There are multiple hearings throughout the year where, you know, Pentagon officials will come in and defend all their budget requests to Congress. That's sort of a good opportunity for us to learn about, you know, the key priorities of where the Pentagon is investing its dollars. and what concerns members of Congress have. So that's really, I mean, where I get a lot of information from. Mark mentioned before, every day new contracts are announced by the Pentagon and they release those to the public. We follow those really closely. Unfortunately, I mean, the classification issues in the military are very extensive and make it difficult for reporters to get all the information that we want. You know, there's been fewer press briefings, particularly under former Secretary Mattis, and that can get into a discussion about civ-mil relations and whether or not a former general or recently retired general should be Secretary of Defense. But it's tough, and I mean, Mark could probably speak to what it was like years ago versus today in terms of transparency and openness.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to realize that when I started, you had to go to the Pentagon every day. You don't have to do that anymore. You have transcripts, you have video briefings. They used to print out the early bird, which was sort of the cheat sheet of all the big news stories that day. You'd get that in the morning and see what you missed. I can remember when you had to send a bicycle messenger to the GAO to pick up a report at 4 p.m. If it involved the F-16, that was of vital importance to my Fort Worth readers. That's completely changed. We have more information today, but less knowledge. And God forbid we have far less wisdom, simply because the proportion of information is so big. And what that requires everyone in this audience to be is their own good editor. There is so much garbage. You see it every day in the various Pentagon clips now that are assembled since the Pentagon gave that up 10 years ago. And you just see all these stories about the new wonder weapons and how great it's going to be. And this is a silver bullet. And it takes an editor to say, haven't I read the story before? And what happened to that time before? And so I think it takes a discerning eye of any consumer of information in the national security space to call out baloney when they see it.
No, that's a great point. We have so much data, swimming in data, but we don't often have that knowledge or that synthesis so that people can make good decisions. Moving on to this next question, we have someone who works in the New York State government and has done work in economic development. So 2 questions. Do you think states need to revisit how they do subsidies when they work with companies like Lockheed or others? And do you think the Pentagon should have a requirement evaluating the impact on competition in their procurement, which I think we talked a little bit about, but I'll throw that out. Anyone have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So on the subsidies they give companies, yes, I would suggest that all states need to stop giving subsidies and stop the race to the bottom. And so what you'll see, and you're talking about New York, one of the companies we've given a ton of subsidies to in New York is General Electric. And General Electric has done nothing but offshore in response. We gave $5 million for them to start a renewable energy program, renewable energy headquarters in Schenectady. And then 4 years later, they shifted over to France when they wanted to buy a company in France. And probably the French government made them do that as part of purchasing it. So now they're making all that stuff over there. The workers in Schenectady also just got a notice this last year that a lot of the turbines they're making, the manufacture of those is being shipped overseas to Poland. I talked to a Department of Energy security expert on that, and they said that, that makes, after the solar winds hacked, everybody's concerned about, the electric grid, right? Well, now we've just added another place close to Russia where it's easier for Russia to get access to those turbines and perhaps put something in the back end that can make the grid more vulnerable. So the subsidies, they don't pay off. Like, these companies will still ship the jobs overseas. And so I think it's a bad practice. As far as the second question, do you think the Pentagon should have a requirement evaluating impact on competition and procurement? So in last year's National Defense Authorization Act, there is a requirement for the Department of Defense to evaluate the effect of competition and antitrust policy on the national security innovation base. So they're going to be doing this assessment. My biggest concern is who's gonna have the pen on that. Is it going to be someone who came from, McKinsey or one of the companies, BCG, KPMG that I mentioned before, who are all parroting that we need to have more industrial consolidation? Is it going to be someone who comes from Lockheed, who obviously has an agenda on that? Is it going to be someone who wants to go to industry after they're in that job? Or are we going to get an actual legitimate look at it? I don't know. I think this is a place where Congress really needs to be active. So they need to be holding hearings on this. They need to be holding people's feet to the fire. They need to be bringing companies in and making sure that they're very clear that they want an assessment like this, which they asked for, to be done properly and to actually take a solid look at the situation.
Thanks, Lucas. This is probably going to be our last question. When the DoD claims they need a merger approval for national security, it shuts down antitrust lawyers. So I'm not super familiar with this, but what's the comeback to the national security argument
And it doesn't just shut down antitrust lawyers, it also shuts down the FTC, because who at the FTC, this is exactly what you said with what we saw with Northrop Orbital ATK merger. The guy who was leading that merger for Northrop was actually the same guy who was the industrial policy person in the Pentagon who originally approved Orbital merging with ATK. So he approves that merger, and then he immediately goes to Northrop and then pursues acquiring them, right? And then we had administration change, and then Ellen Lord goes to the FTC, who was suspicious of this, and says, no, we have to have this for national defense, right? And then they're running scared. And so I think that, everybody says people are policy. I think that's 100% true. No matter which administration you have to have people who are willing to look at this problem and not have some reason to acquiesce to it or just decide, here's the easy route. This is what we want to do because it's simple. It's going to take a lot of effort to reverse this trend.
Well, any other closing thoughts from the group? Thank you so much for joining us today and for all you do in the space. Thanks for all of our participants for joining. I see them dropping off the net as we speak. I think for the American Economic Liberties Project, we'll post a recording of this on probably their website, potentially Twitter, but it'll get posted at a later date. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful day and weekend, because tomorrow's Friday in these COVID times. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Al.
Bye, Ellie. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.